travel narratives that make broader commentaries on development and things like that. I don't know about these ones. Give me a certified one that's not just related to the human. I feel like they get pigeonholed into specific things, obviously, yeah, right. Yeah. Yes. Well, especially to the West. Frank, those guys there as important. And art as an ethnic, yeah.
Right. If you were at a job, then you must have had time to think about the chain and see some of their museums and so forth. And I was visiting, Chinese history. You could say side by side.
We're renovating, but we borrowed space at
This thing
Brookings.
actually works. Glad it works. Glad everything's good.
We ended up with about 90 RSVP. Lunch is going to be crowded. Some people will be at lunch or be in and out for parts of this. We don't know. RSVP. It's easy to RSVP. That doesn't seem to incur an obligation. So, let's give it.
I like it, when you sit in the RSVPs. Colleagues used to tour of China. Was that you or someone emailed me? Was trying to do research in China at the Chronicle about a year or 2 years ago?
I try to go over as much as I can. We have correspondents who are really freelancers mainly to do. But I was there, last time I was there for a long time was for about 2 years ago.
Did we ever take email or talk?
Okay. The liberal arts.
That must be you.
in
Okay.
Asia.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
And so I did a piece on.
Are you on staff with the Chronicle? Or but you are also allowed to freelance to write for others because of your time.
Yeah, although we had a close working relationship at the time. So some of the pieces that I run like the piece called The China Kingdom German, which really investigated
Oh, yeah. Do you just cover students or international? What's your
international. So I cover everything from partnerships with China, with foreign universities rather, to a little bit of study abroad. Not much anymore. There's not much controversy, but
you're looking for controversy?
I'm looking for news. Some of these new campuses overseas, like Yale and U.S. and NYU Shanghai. But I, practically speaking, I spend a lot of time writing about international students, and because of their numbers, about Chinese students.
When I came to my classes, very different.
Did you come for graduate?
Yeah.
Yeah, same.
And I had work experience. It was a very different experience for me. And I knew I'm ready for this kind of education. I'm not here just for education.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point to raise.
Yeah.
And a lot of the preparation is not preparation for the education either. It's preparation to get into the university. So.
I don't think most of them even care what the term is. that's why a lot of the big, I think that's what I wrote in the book. The Chinese education is about credential. As long as you earn the credential, the emperor likes you, then you're set. It's not about what you know, it's about what you prove. It's really
Okay, so I'm going to try to keep you guys on the clock. Our initial presentation, it's 15 minutes, all right?
Yeah, that's fine.
I'll give you a minute or two now. But I really want to have a discussion.
from July.
Yeah, you say that. We all say that when we get up there. It's so hard to keep track. It's somehow time passes differently when oneself is speaking.
I keep my phone on, but then I was giving a speech last week, and it froze up, and I hit it, and then Siri started to talk to me. I was like, oh no.
Stop.
Good morning. Welcome everyone to the Woodrow Wilson Center and to today's program on the promise and perils of Sino-U.S. educational reform. My name is Robert Daly. I'm the director of the Kissinger Institute on U.S. China Relations here at the Wilson Center. And this program today is a new sort of program for us, and I think it's probably new for the Wilson Center as well. And it launches what we intend to be a sustained, serious attempt to bring cultural and educational issues into the mainstream of discussions of U.S. China relations. And for that reason, I would particularly like to welcome some of the educators who are in the room today. We have people from school districts, public school districts, and from universities. You play a major role in U.S. China relations when they are understood in their totality. In 2000, I think, I heard a briefing from Stephen Yates, the China guy who was at that point at the American Enterprise Institute. I had him in to brief a board. And he said something then that crystallized for me, something I'd been realizing slowly but hadn't put in the form that he did. He said, U.S. China relations are now not only geostrategic and economic, U.S. China relations are personal. Chinese are now our neighbors, our co-workers, our students, in some cases our spouses. They're very involved in the fabric of the United States, and I suspect that for most American children now growing up, their first experience of China and their first awareness of China comes through Chinese schoolmates and friends, and this is an enormous change in the United States. My first experience of China, or my first thoughts about China, growing up in the 60s in upstate New York, were frankly racist sing-song chants that we learned from our friends about China. There weren't many Chinese Americans around. So there's a big change, and it's coming in through our schools. There's been an enormous influx of talent from China, as many of you know, not only at the university level, but less widely reported in high schools, middle schools, and elementary schools. And this influx is likely to grow. President Obama and President Xi just met in Beijing at APEC, and they announced a number of agreements that are relaxing on import restrictions for high-tech goods from the United States, military-to-military agreements, climate change, and they also announced a new sort of visa regime in which each country would give 5 to 10-year multiple entry visas. This announcement got less attention in the American press, I think because it sounds merely procedural. It sounds dull. It doesn't touch on economic or strategic issues. But I wouldn't be surprised if this change in visas actually has the biggest impact on U.S.-China relations over the next 5 to 10 years, not only on an increase or recovery in real estate prices in America, but a rapid increase in the number of young Chinese who come here for their primary and secondary education in a way that could play out over decades in ways that we can't anticipate. Educational issues have been part of U.S.-China relations really since the very beginning. As Professor Zhao notes in his book, they really begin with Yong or Ronghong in 1872 with his Yale mission that first brought young students during the Qing dynasty to the United States. Also from the earliest days, we had American educators and educational missionaries going to China. In fact, the founder of the Kissinger Institute, Stapleton Roy, was born in Nanjing, and his parents were educators. John Leighton Stewart, of course, was the first president of Yenjing University, which eventually became Beijing University. Most of China's major universities had their roots in the work of educational missionaries, many of them from the United States. Leighton Stewart was, of course, later the United States ambassador to China. So education has always played a major role. And I've been struck in my work for the University of Maryland and Johns Hopkins and Syracuse and Cornell that universities and now public school districts have China interests and their own China policies. And this is transformative. This is also true of corporations. It's true of cities. It's true of counties. And these China policies of schools and universities are part of what shape the overall relation, and they don't tend to get too caught up in the security dilemma in the Western Pacific and the sorts of things that the governments pay attention to. So you have a very positive role to play. This is also a very good time for U.S. China educational exchanges. We have a lot to learn from each other as the United States gets more worried about its competitiveness, and we want to cling to educational values that foster individual creativity and judgment and development while also boosting our competitiveness. And China is facing the opposite issue. They want to hold on to what they see as the educational values that spur economic growth, but they know that they lack creativity. So we're trying to learn from each other even as we cling on to the bedrock of our own values. And you see this comparison increasingly. You saw it somewhat in the 2011 book, Amy Chua's book, The Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother. And you see a sort of this tendency towards self-flagellation in the United States ever since the publication of A Nation at Risk in the 80s, of our desire to talk down our own educational systems with reference to China's educational system, which is a subject that we'll get into in more detail in a minute. One of my favorite instances of this kind of self-flagellation came in 2009 when The Onion, the satirical newspaper, did a whole issue in which the conceit was China had now bought The Onion, in addition to other things, and it was being written by now Chinese. And so one of their articles, which was written by Yu Wanmei, purportedly, the headline was, this is Chinese, remember, writing about American education, "Potato-faced youngster lauded for memorizing primitive 26-character alphabet." And the text said, "Christopher Pearson, a glassy-eyed, slothful lump of a child, was endlessly praised Monday for recalling the scant 26 letters in the American alphabet. Pearson reportedly rattled off the short series of guttural vowels and lumbering, artless consonants after 10 minutes of prompting. A feat that, judging from his overly indulgent teacher's reaction, must rival the great triumph of launching a satellite into orbit. Though witnesses said the unremarkable 4-year-old may have slurred the letters L through O into one continuous stream of nonsense, he somehow avoided immediate expulsion and reassignment to a rural millet farm." So say the self-flagellation can take less serious forms, but it's also very, very real. I live in a school district up in Howard County that, in fact, prides itself on comparisons to China. The principal of the high school, in her opening remarks to the parents of the new freshman class, bragged about Centennial High School in Howard County, saying, our English and reading scores surpassed those of Shanghai on the PISA exam. This is why you should be glad. This is just this year. This is why you should be glad that your students are coming here. So we have much in common at the university level, and this gets to the second part of the title of today's program, The Promise and Perils of Educational Relations. Both countries now seem committed to the proposition that the primary goal of education is to train a workforce in order to enhance competitiveness. This is actually a relatively new idea in both countries, and therefore testing tends to prevail. As we build more educational exchanges and relations, furthermore, the American government has become concerned. The House of Representatives held yet another hearing on December 4th titled, "Is Academic Freedom Threatened by China's Influence on U.S. Universities?" This was focused on the Confucius Institutes, but also on programs like NYU in Shanghai and Duke in Kunshan. There are also issues within the classroom. Karin Fischer has written about changes in pedagogy, ways that American professors have changed their classrooms and their approaches to education, even their grading systems, because of a high number of Chinese students in the classroom. And of course, this is an age-old American story. Immigrants coming into American schools who may or may not have English, fluent English. But in educational relations, as in all else, even though this is an old American story, China is having an impact at a speed and on a scale that we haven't seen before. So old problems, but new scale and new speed. So to discuss the many related issues, we are delighted today to have Dr. Zhao, Presidential Chair and Director of the Institute for Global and Online Education in the College of Education at the University of Oregon, where he is also a professor in the Department of Educational Measurement, Policy, and Leadership. He is not only a scholar, he's also an innovator and practitioner. He has designed schools, actually built schools that cultivate global competence. He has developed computer games for language learning, and he has founded research and developmental institutions that look at innovative educational models. I was particularly pleased to have him here today because he is the author most recently of Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Dragon? Why China Has the Best and Worst Educational System in the World. This was recently reviewed in the New York Review of Books and also occasioned an interesting interview in the New York Times. It was covered in other places as well. He previously wrote Catching Up or Leading the Way, American Education in the Age of Globalization, and World-Class Learners, Educating Creative and Entrepreneurial Students. He was previously at the University of Michigan.
Michigan State.
I'm sorry, Michigan State?
No, other one, okay.
Sorry. Right. Magic Johnson.
That's tough.
He was born in Sichuan but came to the U.S. in 1992 and received his Ph.D. in 1996 from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Along the way, he spent time at various other institutions, including as a language specialist at Hamilton College, which is a small private school in upstate New York that my family is quite close to. And I'm no doubt, partially because of your work, Hamilton has risen up and is now giving Middlebury a ride for its money. As one of the best Chinese language programs.
For 6 months. I don't think that was.
It wasn't you? Well, anyway, credit nonetheless. We are also very pleased to have with us Karin Fischer, senior writer at the Chronicle of Higher Education, whose work I've been educated by for years now. She covers the business of international education, the globalization of higher education, and the relationship between colleges and the economy for the Chronicle of Higher Education. She has also written about international student recruitment and the experience of foreign students in the U.S. This has become a big topic, especially for Chinese undergraduates. In her work, A Freshman Year Far From Home, which followed 3 Chinese students through their first year on an American campus. She previously worked for the Kiplinger Washington Editors, Media News Group's Washington Bureau, the Charleston Daily Mail, and the New Hampshire Gazette. And a lot of her work, maybe you can tell us how this works, seems to be co-published in the New York Times. I see it in a number of other publications as well, including the Washington Monthly and George Magazine. In 2010, Karin Fischer was selected for the East-West Center's Jefferson Fellowship Program for her reporting in Asia, and she is also the recipient of the Paul Miller and National Press Foundation Fellowship and the Poynter Institute News Reporting and Writing Fellowship. She is a graduate of Smith College. I've asked each of them to speak for about 15 minutes, after which we will open it up. So if Professor Zhao, you could kick it off. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Thanks, Robert. And this is my first time to be here. It's federal buildings are too big for me to navigate. It's bigger than the state of Oregon. It took me a long time to find the place, but I'm glad to be here. First of all, I just want to explain that this book was very hard to write. Was very difficult to write because I did not want to say China is bad. I did not want to say China is good. So this is it is their best and their worst education. So I get both ways. I took the title really from Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, but I cannot get much far because China, as you know very well, has been a fabricated, imagined something. It could be enemy, ally, model, idol. You know this whole thing. And Thomas Friedman talks about let's be China for a day. Those kind of things. So it's very fascinating. And I wrote this book not really discussing about the relationships, but rather to understand where American education can go. So this is really written more for the U.S. audience, not necessarily China audience. And this is precisely in response to the general admiration of the Asian education. And I was just going to show you some of the, I don't know how many of you have seen this, this book. For example, ever since China got to be number one multiple times on the PISA, the China Intertest, and so we suddenly discovered Chinese education is great. When this the data came out in 2009, this is the data came out that China scored number one in everything. It suddenly startled America, and I told them, I said, from the National Center for the Education and Economy, Mark Tucker's group says surpassing Shanghai sounds like we've been left behind. And by the way, America, you read Obama's State of Union address, lots of times said, we have to catch up. We're worried about, China surpassing us. If anything, China surpassed America before there was an U.S., America. That's, if you remember history, right, in the Qin dynasty, for I think thousands of years, China dominated the world economy. So that's the idea. And when, we have Secretary Duncan, Arlene called this a wake-up call. By the way, we got a lot of politicians receiving many wake-up calls. The question is, do they wake up? That's the challenge, I think. But what's interesting, I wrote this book, it's written in response to the idea about we need to surpass Shanghai. And this is a global phenomenon. I'm not only writing for America, but writing for most Anglo-Saxon countries, had Anglo-Saxon tradition, because they have this general admiration of Asia. For example, we have in Australia a big study, the Grattan Institute. I was involved there, actually, and Julia Gillard was there. They came up with a report saying that students in Shanghai are 2 years ahead, which is true in terms of data, 15-year-olds mathematics. And in the U.S., we have even general people, and people actually, this one is, we have one, there's a governor, Ed Rendell from Pennsylvania. I think it's a two-term governor. And one time when there was the issue, they had a football game was canceled, and he was very unhappy about that. He said, football, Philadelphia Eagles, how did that have anything to do with China? But there is connection because China students scored so well. And so this is what he said on radio. He said, we've become a nation of Usis. The Chinese kick our butt in everything. If this was in China, do you think the Chinese would have called off the game? People would have been marching down to the stadium. They would have walked, and they would have been doing calculus on their way down. So this is how we interpret all this kind of data. And then we have England. The former Secretary of Education, Michael Gove, went to Shanghai and Singapore, and he wrote back home, said, I'm happy to confess I'd like us to implement a cultural revolution just like the one they've had in China. And like Chairman Mao, we've embarked on a long march to reform our education. And no surprise, England actually imported 40 math teachers from Shanghai. Now they're teaching over there. And so I wrote this book to say, okay, is this kind of Sinophilia really justified? And what do we see in this? And we see also, I see a dramatic rise in the sense of authoritarianism in this country, in education. We are expecting great policies, standards, and testing out of Washington. And is that a good idea? So I basically traced back the Chinese models to say what really happened is also, by the way, this is also in the economic arena too. We think China has far-sighted planning. That's what we always praise the Chinese in the look long history. In the rumor, I think it's a rumor, always said when Zhao and I was asked about what do you think the implication of the French Revolution, and I don't think that ever happened. But Chinese people like to think that Chinese know everything.
Well, his answer is
it's hard to say,
it's
right?
too soon to say.
It's too soon to tell. That's what I say. So that's really, so we have this view, but I think in my analysis through this book, which is actually not very true. So when I was writing this book, I was really thinking about, number one, did Chinese economic growth recently come from far-sighted planning or not? Because as we praise, we are so unhappy with Congress here. They're bickering all the time, they argue all the time, but in China they seem to be all working together. Is that efficiency what we need? Actually, analysis will show China's economic growth is rather a retreat from authoritarian control, centralized control. So we call Deng Xiaoping is not a great designer, he's a great permitter. He let people to do something. He's more of a freer thing. And the same thing with if you look at education, why is China the best education system? And Chinese education system is the best because precisely it has centralized standards, and the best is relative. Best for what? So I think the Chinese education system is the best if you want compliant, homogeneous workers, and it was great to maintain the imperial order for a long time. So if you want that, so that's the best. I call it the worst is precisely the same thing, because when you produce homogeneous, compliant workers, you will not be able to produce the kind of divergent, defiant individuals who might be creative and entrepreneurial. So where does America come from? And also, you know, America, I don't know if you know this, over the past 20-some years, we have really practically destroyed the traditional American education because it was not good at producing good test scores. We've lost a lot of local control because we didn't think it was efficient. Remember, the authoritarian system is much more efficient. We've lost a lot of more peripheral curriculum. Now we're pushing this thing called Common Core. And you know, other experiences like arts, music, sports, they've been cut out. Children's recess is cutting out. We've also lost a lot more professional autonomy in teachers. So because we're all trying to evolve into one centralized great system that can dictate what children learn, when they learn, how much they progress, and in the name of accountability and trying to out-educate. So my real answer is this, if you read through the whole book, is that if America is trying to outcompete anybody in the 21st century, it has to continue to invent and innovate, build on its traditional strength, not giving that up, because 21st century requires even more of the creative individuals rather than homogenize them. So right now, I think this country, the U.S., is going absolutely wrong direction. So this book is really written as an example to say, great test scores homogenization is not what we need. So that's if America becomes more like the Chinese system, that's the worst it can do rather than the best it can do. So that's where the whole book is about. And of course, it also explains some of this and why, you know, people have this stereotype of kids, people going to the stadium doing calculus on their way. Why do we have the tiger mom? Why do people believe in certain kind of cheating, plagiarism? There's a lot of cultural reasons to explain the behaviors you may observe in other places. But one final point is that China, as well as a lot of East Asian countries like Singapore, like Korea, and Japan, have been working very hard to actually move away from this system, from the tradition, because they recognized, practically China recognized when the Opium War started, 1842, that the traditional way of education does not work for the future. They took them over 100 years, had to dance around. Should we learn from the West? Should we not learn? What should we learn? What we should not learn? It's kind of crisscross and different way of doing hesitance. I call them hesitant learners. You know, we like it, but we don't like it. That's I can relate to how we learn the whole process. So but I need to understand right now, all the Asian systems are working very hard to emulate the U.S. system. They may not be very successful, but that's their desire, or they may not even openly admit to that, but that's what's happening. For example, China now in Beijing just banned testing at all grades, in primary grades. It's no testing, you know, and they're trying to do that. Korea just spent millions of dollars training college admission officers so they know how to admit without relying on test scores. So that's so there's a lot of massive reforms changes over here. I think that's 10 minutes or 15.
You're good. Keep it.
No, I'm done.
You're done.
I told you, I take much less time than you think. You know.
This is great. I spent longer introducing you. Yeah. Okay, Karin Fischer.
Well, thanks very much again for inviting me to be here. As Rob said, I write for the Chronicle of Higher Education. I'm the international reporter, which means I write about everything from study abroad to partnerships like Yale in Singapore, Duke in Shanghai. But in practical terms, I probably spend more of my time writing about international students, and that's because that's really been, in the last 6 or 7 years, the really transformative part of higher education when it comes to international education. And really, that's the story of China. Although certainly international education in general, international student numbers have increased in the, pretty much since, they took a tumble after the terrorism attacks in 2001. But in general, the growth has really, really been about China. Since 2007, it's just been exponential. So now, 1 in every 3 students who's on a foreign visa here and a student visa is Chinese. And that's just unprecedented since we have been tracking the number of international students. There's never been such a dominant group studying in the U.S. There's this kind of joke, in China that if you want to learn how to speak better Chinese, not better English, but better Chinese, then you should go study in America because all your classmates will be from Beijing and Shanghai and Guangzhou. So, I mean, I think if you were to go, I don't know how many of you are spending time on college campuses today, but not just the research universities, but the small liberal arts colleges like Hamilton and Smith, where I went, and also even community colleges. Go to a central place, close your eyes, listen, you're going to hear Mandarin being spoken. And so it's really transforming the way that higher education in the United States actually looks. We mentioned Michigan State and this piece that I did there following the students through their first year, and not 1 in 8 international students, but 1 in 8 freshmen alone at Michigan State was from China the year that I spent there, and that's more than from like any other state in the union combined studying there. Why has this happened? It's sort of, I hate this term, but it's sort of a perfect storm. It really is. Just this confluence of events. Under the Bush administration, Rob mentioned visa policy. They made it much more easy for students, and particularly undergraduates, which is really where the growth has been, to come and study from China to the U.S. You think about it, it's right after the Beijing Olympics. We're talking about a real boom in the Chinese economy, a real sense of affluence, also a baby boom. And so you suddenly have a lot of students, a lot of families who are looking around, and perhaps their son or daughter doesn't do well enough on the Gaokao to get into Tsinghua or Peking. Well, these parents now look around and say, do I want my son or daughter to go to a second-tier Chinese institution, or should they go study in America? Because while we talk about hand-wringing in the K through 12 arena, I mean, there's still a perception, and I think we can debate, sort of access quality versus quantity in the U.S. and sort of elite versus access institutions. But, there's the perception around the world that America really is the gold standard for education. And so you have these parents with the means to send their children to the United States. And then, of course, for every push factor, there's a pull. And you think about 2007, what was happening here? The recession. And the recession hit higher education, and particularly public universities, very hard. They really bottomed out in terms of taxpayer support. So what are you going to do? You're going to have to rely more on tuition. Well, all the families sort of struggling here in the United States couldn't pay for it. Who could? Students from abroad, and particularly from China. And when we're talking at the undergraduate level, they pretty much pay their own way. There's very little financial aid that goes to international students. And they're paying at public universities a much higher tuition rate. And so they're financially attractive. And I don't want to make it seem like U.S. colleges are being mercenary. I mean, there's lots of very good reasons that you also want international students. There was also, I think at this time, just a lot more talk about globalization and about the importance of preparing students for a global world and a global marketplace. And so, you have the desire to have students who, give them a different perspective. I mean, the statistics show the vast majority of American students are never going to study abroad, and so this is their one opportunity to study with somebody from a different country. And then, there's just a pure talent, particularly at the undergraduate level, the graduate level rather, a pure talent issue where, we have certain programs that really rely on the talent of students, not just from China, but from abroad. So what's been the impact? I mean, it's really hard to say in some ways. I mean, we're still just having some of the first cohorts of students kind of come through the system. I'll touch for a minute, although this while I've spent time in China and I've been studying the Chinese education system and higher education system, I certainly defer to the expert here. But there is some extent to which already you can see this sort of study abroad trend affecting Chinese high school, secondary education, even though as a percentage of the overall high school population, a very small percentage will go to study overseas. But, I said before that a lot of the initial trend and interest in studying abroad was often driven by parents going, oh God, my kid didn't do well on this make or break test and they're not going to get into a good university. Now you have parents deciding very early on to opt out. And this is critical because you can't opt back in. Once you decide you're not going to study within the Chinese curriculum, there's no going back. You can't sit for the Gaokao. And so there's been this boom in international schools or international divisions within Chinese high schools that really are seeking to prepare a pipeline of students to go abroad. And so in some cases, they've led to some real curricular reform. I mean, I spent some time in a high school in Beijing that really felt, quite frankly, like a freshman seminar at a small liberal arts college. I mean, it was, very, very focused on, debate and dialogue and questioning and free expression. You also see the adoption of American curricula and foreign curricula, the AP, the International Baccalaureate, the British system for students who want to go study in the British system. You also see, though, and this is something that we were just talking about before we came on, ways in which rather than having an educational curricula that prepares students to succeed on a Chinese entrance exam, that you're seeing students with preparation for American college entrance exams. So lots of drilling for the SAT, lots of prep for TOEFL, the English language test. But it is an interesting question about what the impact will be on higher education, or on education rather, in China. Thus far, the government has really been pretty hands-off when it comes to students coming to study abroad. They have in recent months begun to implement some tightening, some restrictions on these international schools and international programs, but there's very little to suggest it's about it's being spurred by concerns about students studying abroad, but more about these schools are obscenely expensive, some of them. They can cost you as much as a year of college tuition here in the States. And so I think there's some concern that there's some mercenary nature in that and maybe some sort of backhanded deals. And in fact, it's become big business. There are countries, or companies rather, in China that have sprung up to do all this in a private sector kind of outsourcing model. I don't want to take up too much of our time, but let me just say I've talked a little bit about what's been happening in China, but I spend a lot of my time, the Chronicle I'm mainly writing for an American audience, and so I spend a lot of my time also asking, what does this mean for American colleges? I think it would be fair to say, and I think even my friends in higher education would agree, that nobody was really prepared for like the force and the magnitude of this kind of like China wave crashing on campuses. And so colleges kind of opened the door, and oh my God, there were so many people who wanted in. And so now it's, as Rob said, really affecting questions about pedagogy, about integration, everything from Chinese students don't like the hamburgers and pizza in the cafeteria. How are we going to, to serve them properly food that they will eat? To what happens when we know disproportionately students from overseas like to study in a very small number of majors. What happens when half of our business class is Chinese? What does that do to the ways that we teach? What does it do to the environment in the classroom? And good or bad, I think these questions are being wrestled with kind of as they're occurring rather than in kind of some sort of strategic planned way. Because, I'm at Michigan State, I just remember talking with the advisors at the business school who were doing, I think it's fair to call it triage. They had so many students, international students, almost all Chinese, to advise that they started at 6 in the morning, they went to 8 that night just to get everybody signed up for class. At one point, the lead advisor in the business school was on the phone with the math department just pleading, please open more sections of this math requirement, because we have so many Chinese students, they're not going to be able to proceed in their classes. And so, he was very much having to, it's not like somebody said, oh, hey, what do you think about us bringing, thousands of Chinese students to East Lansing, Michigan? He was having to deal with it in real time. And so let me just leave there. There's just tons that I know we can talk about. So I'm very excited to hear your questions and thoughts as well.
I want to pose a question to each of our speakers, then we'll open it up. First, Professor Zhao, those of us who deal with U.S. China relations all the time, it's always very difficult in looking at any one particular phenomenon in China to distinguish what is Chinese from what can be attributed to the Chinese Communist Party and the nature of governance. And this was a question I had as I read your book, because you attribute what works least well in the Chinese system to authoritarian government, which I think most American readers would think is an indictment of the Communist Party. In fact, toward the end of the book, you say that in order to really refine the system, reform the system, to train more innovative students, quote, if the Chinese government takes these actions, your recommendations, it will mean the end of an authoritarian regime. At the same time, as you read in, you make it very clear that China is aware of these problems. It is trying to reform, but that this is actually a much more deeply Chinese problem. When schools, in all sincerity, say, do less homework, the parents use that time to put their kids into more bushiban and special classes to compete to go into the university. So could you talk about that? To what degree is this a Chinese sort of cultural issue, and to what degree do you see it as being an issue that's tied particularly to the form of government within China?
Thank you. I think I had several dilemma in the book. This is not a China dilemma. I think it's an East Asian dilemma. Actually, it's a cultural dilemma. Even in Singapore, they have the same issue. The dilemma you had that was from Alice in Wonderland. I think bread and butterfly. Remember that bread and butterfly that with a head made of sugar. So, but its only diet is hot tea. So if he doesn't drink hot tea, it's going to starve to death. If he drinks, the head melts. So that's what I call this whole issue, because we know if you look at the whole human history that a lot of times authoritarianism gives the sense of orderliness and cleanliness. But also China, I think not on China, Japan did the Meiji Restoration much earlier than others. So they had more Western, the clear claim to be Westernized, earlier. And some people attribute that how Japan won the Sino-Japan War in the 1890s. So China has been struggling how much they want to Westernize. So in the beginning, of course, they wanted Western technology without Western thoughts. 中学为体，西学为用. Some of you may know this phrase, talk about the self-strengthening movement, where everything remains Chinese. We just want your thing. We can eat your hamburger without thinking like your hamburger way. That's the kind of idea. And it did not work very well. So the Chinese Communist government, I don't think it's as communist as many other people think. There are many incarnations of communists, different societies. It is really, for me, a continuation of imperial rule. We used to have one big boss. Now it's more kind of I think it's emperors incorporated now. It's kind of a corporation, multiple emperors and together but the rule and ruling ideas the same. It's one party rule. You want everybody to think the same way. But there, especially right now, if you go to China, I'm actually going there tomorrow. I'm going to talk to a bunch of economists on the Xinhua News Network, talk about the so-called the new normal of Chinese economy, which is going to be about, say, the economy has to be driven by innovation. And they recognize that very well, where can you get innovative talents? So we're relaxing more government regulations. You probably noticed new government. And then we want to change the education system, bringing different things in. And at the same time, we want to control this. So this is actually quite interesting dilemma. That's why I do not have much hope, honestly, in this reform unless you abandon it. But once you reform it, it won't be the same. And so that's how I think the culture, even the Chinese Communist rule, reflects and reproduces the traditional authoritarian culture.
Is there a Chinese language edition of the book? Will there be?
I have no idea. And most of my books have been translated and published in Chinese. And there's a lot of people in Hong Kong that have strong interest in this book, and in Singapore as well, because I'm really talking about the struggle. Some people think I'm kind of think they have to be a dichotomous. Sometimes it is a dichotomy, right? If you homogenize, you won't have this whole thing. So I try to really warn this thing. Another idea, I think, Rob, thanks for asking the question, is that authoritarianism does not have to belong to an authoritarian government. Because in the U.S., I really want to emphasize this, we see a rise of authoritarian thinking, even in higher education. Like the federal government, for example, wants us to report employment rate. You can't control, that's a different story. We want to...
The employment rate of graduates of universities.
Yeah, report, we want to hold you accountable. So, next year if I don't graduate, my graduates don't find jobs, then I'll be fired. So I think we are really deviating from, we think government can hold schools accountable for producing certain type of things. So authoritarianism does rise really in even democratic countries when we find democracy is not as effective or efficient as authoritarian systems. Just one last point, just more to support Karin's point, is that we need to also understand that education is a major actually economical trade as a product. And ironically, most of the Asian system have been importing the Western products. I don't know if in Australia, for example, education as a product is only second largest, second to mineral exports. So education, and in New Zealand, 1/5 of their GDP once was really Chinese Asian students. So America exports a lot of our education products and teachers. So if we have teachers who can find jobs here, go to Asia, they will hire you. It's not a problem. So that's another issue we need to think about. I think it was last year, how much $1 billion the Chinese students bringing, about 8 billion, something like that. Yeah, something like that.
Karin, you spoke a little bit about the effort to globalize or internationalize American universities. This has always seemed a little strange to me. Universities, the universal, has always comprised the global. And it seems to me there's a disconnect between American universities, which speak of globalization, universities without borders, and they want to attract more and more foreign students as part of that campaign. But most of those foreign students, particularly the Chinese, are very clear that they want to come to an American university. There are programs that for some local programs I'm familiar with, master's programs, that are about 95% Chinese student enrolled. Well, this is then functionally a Chinese classroom in which their educational values and dispositions will prevail. There's the question of what happens if you're the sole Norwegian or American in the classroom. But then is this fair even to the Chinese students who come for an American experience? There's a tension there. You've spoken with a lot of students. What is their experience of this? Do they experience this as a problem, or do they just want to get a degree and get a job and move on?
It's definitely both. I mean, I have talked with many students who feel very frustrated for precisely that reason. They say, if I wanted to go to school with other Chinese students, I would have just stayed in China. Why have my parents made this enormous investment in my education when I'm surrounded by other Chinese students? You also hear complaints, frankly, from American students who really feel like this is not what I thought I was getting. It changes the dialogue in the classroom. It changes the tone of the classroom, and they've been unhappy with it. On the other hand, I do think, Chinese students are certainly not a monolith, and there's certainly different reasons why why they and their parents choose to come to the United States. Many of them do really believe in the notion of an American education and the critical thinking and that it brings. But many are coming for really bottom line economic reasons, and they know that American education is a credential that is valuable, and they're not really necessarily coming here to learn so much as to get that degree and to tick those boxes. I mean, I guess the real question, though, that I have, and we're not going to know this for the next several years, but what happens when these students return to China, which is we all know it's a very relational society and a very networked society. The assumption has always been that having this American degree is going to give you an edge, but this has already been something that I'm starting to see questioned in the Chinese press, where they've done some surveys of employers that said we're Chinese companies. Having an American education doesn't do anything for us, and so will those very bottom line concerns, will they change then that dynamic of what Chinese students want in coming to the U.S.? I don't know.
Well, there's a tremendous amount of expertise in the room here today, universities, NGOs, journalists, public school districts. So let's open it up. And if you could please introduce yourself before you ask your question. So we go first here.
Hi, my name's Jen Pearl. Oh, thank you. My name's Jen Pearl, and I work at Indiana University in Bloomington and manage international programs. We have 3,000 Chinese students in Bloomington, and Bloomington just saw the opening of its first KTV locally. So our concern is developing cross-cultural competency for all of our students, our international students and our American students. And we see people kind of just sticking with their own groups, the American students together, the Chinese students together. And I was wondering if you've seen any best practices for building bridges between student groups so they can really be learning from one another and building cross-cultural competency.
Gosh, I'd be very hesitant to say any best practices, because I do think it's something that many universities are struggling with. I mean, because if you think about it, until very recently with this boom, who international students at your campus were probably mostly graduate students. And at smaller institutions like the one that I graduated from many years ago, there were certainly quite a large percentage of my classmates were international students, but there's only 2,000 students, period, at my college. And so the ability to kind of very deliberately seek to integrate the students was something that was much easier to do. And so I see a lot of colleges trying to take what small liberal arts colleges did, and it doesn't necessarily translate very well to the large university. One thing that I've seen that I find kind of interesting, and I hesitate really to call it a best practice, but I'm curious how it works out, is it was sort of spurred from this notion that when you have students come into orientation and they're jet lagged, and they're having a million things thrown at them, what are they really going to retain? And so one of the real challenges I think that colleges are finding is just preparation for an American classroom. So both culturally and just very practically, the study skills that these students have. And so some colleges have set up kind of semester-long orientation programs. I think they mean well, but then they have the challenge of further ghettoizing some of these international students. But I've seen some colleges do something where they are trying to, at least on a voluntary basis, get Americans in those classrooms as well. Because I think the thing we always talk about is how do you get the Chinese student or the international student to adjust to America, but also how do you get American students, if that's one of our goals, to sort of figure out how to interact with their new international classmates. And so some of these colleges have had these programs where they're putting both international and American students together to go through this very directed kind of a program. I think the jury's still out, but I think they're at least an interesting model.
Professor Zhao, any thoughts on the question?
Yeah, when I was in Michigan State, we actually tried to deal with this problem a while back, and we came up with some ideas. I left. I don't know what they're doing now. I'm in Oregon, and we still have the same issue. And so I think one of the things we suggest is that could we do some more early kind of mixture of students? So send some of your freshman students or your maybe seniors to China to spend a week, 2 days, do some orientation that way, to hang out in there. It's more building relationship. We're also talking about possibly of really forced dorm pairing, students dorm. And again, of course, that's really controversial. Right now, people always say, some schools are being get better by allowing you to choose your roommates online. I actually think that's a bad idea in education, because now in the age of internet, you guys notice nobody disagrees with you anymore, because all your Facebook are your friends, your Twitter people like you. But I think actually part of education is put that discomfort in there. So we just talk about another, of course, traditional way. I think this is not. By the way, this ghettoization is not new. We know different race groups always try to hang out together, and so you need to build platforms to force them to deal with. So I think a mentoring program, predominant by American, we call traditional American students, to parent them might be very helpful in that regard. And of course, finally, one of my students at Michigan State did a doctoral study on this one. Technology is really hurting the Chinese students assimilating, because now they have Skype, they're on WeChat with their friends all over. They're doing homework together across institutions. Maybe in Bloomington is doing homework. So they really almost have no need. And also we have, by the way, all Chinese students are bringing more authentic Chinese food and Chinese groceries too. So they really can hang out together. Those dorms provide Chinese restaurants. It's really interesting. So you want to get rid of those, force them to eat the Indiana Bloomington pizza. That can help as well. Get rid of the Chinese restaurants.
I think that practices, too, are tied into this question of what universities are for, whether they're for education in the old sense or whether they're simply about pre-professional training. If we're doing pre-professional training, then these questions really don't matter very much. You just get your degree and you move on. And I've been involved with universities who have asked me to actually present to their administrators, and the question they're asking is, do we understand the Chinese students culturally? And I think the bigger question is, do the Chinese students and the Indian students and the Saudi Arabian and the American students understand the idea of the American university? They applied, the culture that obtains is the culture of Indiana or Johns Hopkins or whatever else it might be. Its standards of intellectual freedom, rigor, and so that I think it's a different way of framing the challenges. I think you'll always be stomping out fires if you think that the university somehow has to respond to all of the different cultures that might be there, rather than having people actually sign on to embrace the culture of the institution they applied to. So there's a question there. Sir.
Hi, Pei Xu from Voice of America. Basically, I have two questions. One is about the Anglo-Saxon world. The other is education in this country. I believe that it is the great U.S. China scholar Benjamin Schwartz wrote about more than 60 years ago. He wrote that since the takeover of the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese education, in our sense, will be prostituted. Very strong word, prostituted. And these days we know that, Chinese the education is heavily prostituted. As long as you have money, you have power, you can get everything, including PhD. And we know that President Xi Jinping got a PhD. And thousands of Chinese officials got a PhD. God knows, or everybody knows, how they got their PhDs. Okay, so, and don't get me started on the institutionalization.
Let me get you started on the Anglo-Saxons. What's the question?
My question is, how much, to what extent is the Anglo-Saxon world aware of the fact that the Chinese education under communism is heavily prostituted? my question about Chinese education. Another is, I have 2 kids who are public school students, high school students here. And to my great surprise and to my great chagrin, that, for instance, we are here in this country are for critical thinking, and critical thinking must be based on freedom to debate. And to my great surprise and chagrin, that I found that my kids in school usually, not usually, always in classroom, they refuse to debate critical, important issues, such as the torture debate, such as gay marriage, such as gun control. And I wondered aloud and asked my kid, oh, if you cannot debate such critical issues, how can you learn from school? What's the meaning of education in school?
Let me turn it over then to the speakers.
So,
Well, I think the first of all, about the Chinese education system, I don't think this Chinese government does worse or better than any other emperors. When you have a dictatorial government, authoritarian government, when education does not really mean education, it simply means credentialing. You can prove, as long as you get a driver's license, you don't have to drive. And that's why in China you used to have fraud in cheating on driver's license test. I said, why do you want to do that? But we just say, I got a driver's license. So credentialing is very important, which actually implies why a lot of Chinese students here, they don't even care to go to school. They care about getting credentialing. So but under authoritarianism, that's how we do it. That's why American education now, we have the same problem with AYP. We don't really care what you learn. That goes to children not debating. Because debating is a waste of time, for test scores. If you want to get bad test scores, debating is horrible, So, under No Child Left Behind, actually after right now, we've heard a lot of law school professors complaining. Our new students come to colleges, American students, under No Child Left Behind, are much more interested in finding answers than asking questions. They don't want to ask because they are rewarded. Authoritarian system rewards your ability to give me the answer however you get it. Under all emperors, all those Keji, those Jinshi, a lot of scholars, they bought them. This is not new under communists. It's under any regime. If it's authoritarianism, fraud and cheating will happen. Look at the U.S. today. Under No Child Left Behind, how many Atlanta, Washington, D.C. down here. People cheat to get those things. That's why we have to return education to actually more enlightening of people, democracy. Accountability has to be intrinsic accountability to avoid that. So any approach to dictate an authoritarian system creates massive amount of fraud. So I'm not defending the communist government. I'm saying if we go to the authoritarian approach, fraud results.
But if I could just follow up based on your book, one of your critiques of PISA that you quote, PISA has many critics, is that what PISA really does is that it tests students' ability to complete tasks included in the test, not their general ability to understand and succeed. And this is, on the one hand, very true. On the other hand, it's really an assault on metrics and the social sciences. How are we to know whether a school is producing the kinds of students that we want? And as soon as you have any kind of metric, and I tend to, this is the attempt to quantify qualities, right? It's a problem, but as soon as you have any kind of metric, you're going to have these problems in the United States or in China. So how would you deal with that?
Well, Donald Campbell, the psychometrician who came up with this idea called the Campbell's Law. He said the Campbell's Law is that if you apply any quantitative measures to monitor any social cause, it leads to corruption. That's why we have people cheating on SAT and manufacture those things. So the best way to avoid that is through what we call multiple sources. You do multiple sources and not just one measure. That's why U.S. College admissions, by the way, I spoke yesterday at NIASC in the New England Schools Boston Conference to all the people about the accreditation. One of the things about the U.S. is about it uses multiple sources. It's like SAT grades, SAT recommendation. So it's less likely to manipulate the system. And if you use one measure, it's much more likely. So you take multiple sources and multiple indicators. Look at a school system. You should look at, let's say, a curriculum. how broad the curriculum is. You look at student growth on their own way. You look at teachers, have you helped someone gain hope? You look at equity, do we invest enough? So there's different measures. I wrote another book for this, and if you want to read this, another book I wrote before. So do you want to read that book?
Do I want to read it?
I'm just joking.
There was, yes, you, sir, then go back here.
Hi, my name is Brian Yanantuano, and I work for the Amazon Foundation, and we facilitate different cultural and exchange programs, mainly between the U.S. and China, at the student, teacher, administrator, and policymaker level. And one of the main underlying assumptions of our programs such as ours or the 100,000 Strong Initiative is that by creating these people-to-people relationships and building cross-cultural competency, we can somehow affect the geostrategic relationship between these two countries and even promote peace, or at least understanding of each other's issues. And my question to both of you is this hope or assumption misguided, or is this actually how it's occurring in real life? And the second question I have is, as more and more Chinese students come over here in this crashing wave, is China experiencing a brain drain of sorts? Are more Chinese students opting to stay here in the Western world instead of helping fuel innovation back home?
Karin, do you want to take a first crack?
Well, let me answer your second question first, and the answer is pretty much no, because of American immigration policy. It's very difficult for these students to stay, even if they wanted to. I think one of the issues, though, will be, as I said before, how well positioned will they actually be when they return to help fuel that kind of entrepreneurial economic spirit. I mean, both because will they have the networks, and there's some suggestion, I mean, and this was of course looking mostly at graduate students, but some suggestion that that in venture capital, because students who'd earned their graduate degrees overseas didn't have the same networks, they were less effective venture capitalists, for example. But there's also this question of to what extent are American universities, if we're just going to think about this as an economic transaction, how prepared are American universities to help students from China and elsewhere abroad get jobs, good jobs when they go back? And not only do these conversations at universities have to start happening, I think, between admissions and international offices and the departments and majors, but with the career services office, if we're going to sort of answer that question. To your first question, I mean, what you're talking about is sort of educational diplomacy, right? And it's sort of fueled, this kind of approach that the State Department, for example, has taken to cultural exchanges for a long time. I think there's nothing inherently problematic with the idea, but the notion is, I think we have this notion that if we just put a Chinese student and an American student in proximity to each other, magic will happen and cultural understanding will be gained just by having them together. And it has to be way more intentional. And I think how to be intentional and smart about it is something that I imagine you're struggling with, and I think a lot of other colleges are as well.
I just wanted in the book I wrote about this, the China education mission. That was a good story to illustrate both answers. This is about 150 years ago. 102, I think, boys of age of over 12 were sent over here to Hartford, Connecticut area. And the idea is for them to learn Western education so they can go home, build better technology, military, and all those kind of things. And those people were placed in families, like homestays, a lot of through the church. And then the emperor quickly discovered these people become too Americanized. They began to hide their pigs, and they began to play baseball, and they're very good baseball. They formed a baseball team. They began to go to church, and they began to date American women. And so they had aborted the mission, by the way. And so that goes to what answers. One is that I think these people, a lot of them went back to treated as traitors, by the way, but some of them become very successful introducers of Western ideas, and they become diplomats, they become engineers, some of them. But also what it shows is that I think now it's not so much a brain drain versus brain gain. I think China actually gains, because of globalization, and China gains a lot through the process. Actually, in many Americans, even when I was in Michigan State, we have local Chamber of Commerce said, why do we teach this communist Chinese students all the time? Just because they're gaining knowledge. They go home, they become our competitors. That's another long-term relationship we need to address. And I stayed here, and I was a international student once at Illinois, and I stayed here. So I think the issue needs to be a lot more. But one big problem is that with the large number of Chinese students today in smaller places, they have almost no way to interact with American community. That's why in Bloomington, seriously get rid of the Chinese restaurants and the grocery stores and eat this great Indiana corn. They'll get more Americanized. But I think that get in interaction with American society and community will be critical, because as we know, when you go take a course on technicality, does not help you understand the culture part of it.
But this is why I think it's important to bring younger Chinese students into the equation, because we don't have good statistics on it, but the number in high schools, private especially, but also public and younger, is going up very fast, and they have a very different, very integrated experience that speaks against that. So I think we want to, in this conversation, not only focus on universities, but also what's happening in earlier stages. Way to the back, to the left, and then way to the back, to the right, please.
Thank you. I'm Ye Liangxia from Cato Institute. I was a former professor of economics in Peking University. My question is, in recent days, I found many Chinese students, after their graduation and they got U.S. degrees, they still have ideologically concept that China has some characteristics. There are some reasons to not take or adopt constitutional democracy and rule of law. And each time, if you try to convince him, he has a lot of reasons, which is the CCP try to give people. So I have the doubt, serious doubt about American education, whether American education help with their way of thinking when pursuing their degrees. Not only they can pass examination, but ideologically, the way of thinking, or the reasoning, or the analytical thinking and writing, it should be something, the foundation for them. For some people, I can understand, like Bo Guagua, the son of Bo Xilai, those princelings. They have the reason to decline the good values, because when they return, like a Kim Jong-un, they can continue their dictatorship. But for most of the other people, the common, the children of the common families, why do they cannot change their ideas after maybe 5 years or 10 years education in the U.S.? Can I call that a kind of a failure of the American education system? Of course, maybe it's not too picky to say that way. It should be some reason to explain that. Thank you.
I'd like to take a first crack at this one, wearing my hat as the former American director of the Hopkins Nanjing Center. We've got a lot of people here today, students, administrators, faculty, fellow American directors who are involved with the Hopkins Nanjing Center. I would answer very strongly that no, that is not a failure of the American education system, because it's not aimed at propaganda or convincing foreign students of the wisdom of our system. The American education system should help the student, no matter what he or she believes, to make a strong argument, to use evidence, to think critically, to consider other views, no matter where they land. And so I would actually be quite strongly opposed to, I think, what's implicit in your question, that the American education system should convince people that we have the right political system. One of our graduates of the Hopkins Nanjing Center went on, who was very successful at Hopkins Nanjing, very involved, open-minded, thoughtful, critical thinker, subsequently became a very adamant deputy editor of the Global Times, wrote a lot of things I didn't much care for, then went on to a university. But he was a terrific student. We don't judge his success or the success of a program by his subsequent beliefs.
I would agree. I think the America, one of the issues is that many people believe America should be one view, one ideology. So I'm very happy we have the Tea Party, we have the Coffee Party, we got all kinds of. I'm serious. I think a democracy is a nation with divergent views. So when people complain, oh, Congress too divided. It's supposed to be. Otherwise, if we think the same way, why would we even have all these elections? I think as a university, we train our people to think critically, consider all kind of views. So I don't believe, it's our job to do this. That's why, we cannot move from one authoritarian system to another one. It's like someone said, I love national standards if I get to write it. That's not the right way to do it.
I would simply say, I think the one question that people have is with this new group of students, if to what extent, going overseas, whether it's for students coming here or for Americans going to study abroad, is one of, I think the people always say, it makes you think more critically and know yourself and your culture better. And I think one of the questions is that process getting to happen, no matter what the results are, if students are not sort of either fully participating in the classroom experience and getting that kind of critical thinking, or if they are, not getting really exposed to students who are not from similar backgrounds as they are.
At the back.
Hi,
We'll come
thank
back
you.
forward again.
I'm Jim Millward. I teach Chinese history at Georgetown. And I have a question for Professor Zhao. I'm afraid to say I haven't read your book, but I did read the New York Review of Books review quite closely. And I agree with almost all aspects of your critique of both Chinese and American educational systems. But there's a couple things that I wondered about. And one of them is sort of the picture that you give of Chinese education sort of creating a race of uncreative drones, right? I'm exaggerating what you're saying. Obviously, it's more nuanced than that. But there's that aspect to it. And I heard that before. We used to say that in this country about Japan, when Japan was kicking our butt economically. And actually, it goes back to a very old Orientalist view of Westerners of the East, that they're sort of mindless, collectivist, communitarian kind of people, and we're feisty individualists. And it serves as a kind of self-congratulatory excuse in America, I think, kind of a reverse AQism, right? Shanghai students may be doing better on their math exams, but, well, we're at least creative and individual, even if we can't pass the tests, right? So, so I want to ask you about that, but then also put that in the context of what seems to me, you seem to be comparing testing in America and the testing boom here with reliance on testing traditionally in China. But I wonder if the tests are really the same sort of thing, right? I haven't taken the Gaokao, but I've talked to a lot of parents whose kids are doing it, and I've had my own kids go through our standardized tests. Our kids don't study for standardized tests. And in China, for all of these major tests, you have to study for them. And so there's a difference in testing content versus just kind of showing up, doing what you can do, and then the results of the test basically affecting the teachers more than they affect the students themselves. So I wondered what you'd say about those two issues.
Thanks, Jim. I think the first one is that I will be the first to condemn American education. I think it has a lot of problems. The issue is the fix. We're fixing the wrong thing in the wrong way. So I'm not saying American education can definitely be much more rigorous. I have 2 children going through the system, and we're just fixing it the wrong way. America needs to be more autonomous, needs to be a lot more challenging, needs to support individuals even more going that direction. So if, that's why I wrote the other book talking about this whole thing in 2009 called Catching Up or Leading the Way. So my critique is more Americans trying to become as obsolete as the Asian system because that they produce. So that's number 2. You're absolutely right. Americans right now, because our high stakes are not putting on students. So your students may not suffer from that. However, what's happening now, our high stakes on teachers, institutions, it results in massive curriculum narrowing. And you know, American education, now if you focus on two subjects, we fix you, that's fixed mindset. That's just going out there. And if you look right now, we are wasting a lot of our resources here. We have. But the American education, we're endowed with more resources than most countries. But now we're using the same resource to produce the same test results as other countries, which is misleading, you know. But I won't be surprised very soon. If your children are still in school system, might be, because now our high stakes is on schools. We fire principals, fire teachers. But if we shift that to the individuals, that may happen. Already, I say in Australia, they have a low stakes test, but kind of high stakes called NAPLAN, the National Assessment Program for Literacy and Numeracy. There are already parents getting their kids preparing for that. Imagine we began to do SAT. So yes, your observation is absolutely accurate, but I think when America needs to do something different, we cannot do retrospective and great in the past.
I'm Peggy Blumenthal from the Institute of International Education. And one short point and one longer point. On the first point, we actually do know how many Chinese students are in U.S. high schools. IIE recently produced a study that shows that there are 23,000 Chinese high school students in American classrooms. And I think that's about a little less than 10% of the number that are in that are in U.S. colleges and universities. These are going to be very important people, and as they're coming to high school so that they can go into college, and they will be a bridge, I think, between the Chinese students who come here just fresh from China as freshmen and these other kids. And so I think there's actually a very important thing happening.
Do you have the growth rate in that number?
We don't. This is the first time we've done the study. 2 years from now, we'll have the growth rate. But they are a very large percentage of the international students in high schools. And they're often in public schools, which is not why, you know, most of them in private schools. So anyway, it's on our website, iie.org. You can find it under publications. The other thing I just wanted to say that, particularly to Karen's point, I think we shouldn't underestimate the impact of study abroad just as study abroad. The Chinese students can all hang around with each other. They can only talk Chinese to each other. That's what Americans do when they study abroad. But most Americans who study abroad clung together. They don't talk to other people, but they are transformed even for a 1 month study abroad, and certainly for a 4-year study abroad. And I think that Chinese who go through the American system, even if they have a Chinese roommate, even if they eat Chinese food, they come back changed in terms of the same way that Americans are changed. They're empowered, they feel more independent, they think more critically, and I think they are changing China. I think the faculty who went back to China after getting their PhDs here have changed Chinese universities, and I think you see it when they get to be vice presidents, but even in their classroom. I don't know whether you agree with me or not.
Karin,
Go ahead.
I guess I would say first to Peggy's first point, I mean, we don't know about the growth rate, but measurably, but we do know anecdotally, and actually there seems to be this shift to younger and younger students coming, and so there used to be almost everybody came as a graduate student, and actually for the first time this year we're seeing graduate numbers from China go down, at least according to the Council of Graduate Schools. And so, I mean, I do think it's going to be an interesting question to watch as we get kind of significant numbers of students come through the high school pathway, what that does, and does that change the population then? I mean, I think that the second question is really, it's a tough one because, you know, I mean, I think colleges certainly feel like they are not doing their job if, you know, all the students are only hanging out with other students. And the other thing that they're not getting is colleges are very explicitly saying that one of the reasons they want to bring foreign students to the U.S. is this internationalizing effect that they will have. And so for the colleges, are they getting, aside from the tuition dollars, of course, are they getting what they want out of this population if they are kind of on an island of their own?
I just want to add something, Peggy. I think I absolutely agree with you. I think I'm a big fan of study abroad. But based on some of the research, we also know that there are different types of study abroad. The quality definitely matters. Like John Dewey once said that he went to Japan and he went to China. But one time he said sometimes just going abroad just basically reinforces your stereotypes. If we go back and well, all right, I knew that were that, I'm this. So I think that's why maybe one of the people ask questions like that. You come here, I say, no, and then you go back with more authority. I was in China. I'm sure this is this way. That's the kind of things we have to be very careful about. And also, you're right. We actually got a lot of people come from U.S. back on Chinese faculty. Sometimes, I don't say they implement the wrong thing, but they have very limited exposure if they're only in the lab. They really don't understand American culture, how it functions, but they may have some interaction. They go back there. And those kind of, half-truth might be more dangerous sometimes. So that's why I would like to see a lot more work on improving the quality of it. But study abroad is better than stay in Bloomington. I'm sorry, I can picking on you guys.
So the 23,000 number, if we take into consideration short term, is still low because there's an enormous industry in summer educational programs for Chinese high school students. Georgetown Day School, Choate, Phillips, Exeter. So many higher numbers coming through that way. Come up front, and lots of questions. We'll get good. Let's go. Let's try to get everybody in with short questions, short answers, and we'll try to give everybody a voice.
Stephen Smith from the Emerson Foundation. Excuse me. Hi. There's a phenomenon I can only sort of, it's been suggested to me there's a sort of a China fatigue among U.S. educational institutions, from higher education out even to the K through 12 schools. And what I mean by that is schools are sometimes referring to the fact that they're constantly bombarded by not only legitimate Chinese universities and educational institutions, but also agencies, and even by Chinese who've come to the United States, immigrated, were formerly students, but have set up their businesses to do joint educational cultural exchange with China. And they're constantly approached by various groups, and they really don't know how to vet them. What will lead to a promising cooperation and what won't? And how do you handle this steady, constant, number of people trying to reach you, trying to set up something between the U.S. and China? What would you advise a school, a U.S. school, how to vet this process? Thank you.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, there's no question that international education, and particularly with China, is a big business. I mean, I always say that before American colleges realize that something could be sold as a business, there will be a company in China that is doing it. So there are companies that do everything from helping you get into college to you're having trouble taking your American class. Well, we're going to hire a bunch of American faculty members to go teach summer programs back in China, and then you'll somehow get that credit back as study abroad. I mean, I think this has really been challenging for American colleges. Let me just talk about one slice of it, which is in the admissions side. I think there's no substitute for being on the ground and really and whether that means you're physically on the ground or you're building relationships with trusted partners. So you see a lot of American universities who are getting students through these third parties that they often didn't even know were involved in it. Kind of now either setting up, their own offices in China, employing alumni to interview students, getting video conference services so that they can know that the students they're getting are actually who they say they are and are as prepared as they want. I mean, just hard work and attention is probably the answer.
I would just say I think I've seen a lot of people get burned, if you want to mean that. It's many people in the U.S. I get a lot of people asking me to partner as I'm a professor. I don't partner with anybody. And there's a lot of business getting people, really. They quit their job here. They thought they'd be offering a job over there. Didn't realize. I mean, it's a lot of things. I would say, Randy, I think a big thing, I would agree with Karin, you have to build relationships. It's understand the Chinese culture, and because the Chinese culture is very transactional, honest, right now. It's very transactional, just one-time deal. If we think it's long-term, it's actually not. They just get it done, it's right now. So they're not doing long-term. That's why they're cheating, fraud. They're not there for a long time. So unless I would build a really trustworthy relationship. Since we have so many people, maybe find someone who has been educated here to work on that and do the due diligence. It takes the transaction cost is much higher to business in China than any other place right now, as far as I know. Maybe there's worse places, but I know in China. So it takes the time and efforts and really find the right person. I have no other suggestion.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Caitlin Moss. I'm a master's candidate at the School of Advanced International Studies. But my question to you all really comes from my experience as a Teach for China fellow, where I worked as a middle school teacher in a rural school. And in my work there, daily I was confronting the differences between the education systems of the U.S. and China. And my question is really about incentives. And I know, Dr. Zhao, you mentioned Campbell's Law and sort of the multiple sourcing, the SATs, grades, et cetera. And I feel like sort of operating within the system, but at the same time being outside of it, I saw that not only students, but many local teachers were very constrained by, like you said, having to prepare purely for tests. But when I would talk to them about kind of their incentives, one of the answers that they came to me with is, well, the way the system works is a solution for China purely because of the number of people. And it would be impossible for us to use a system similar to the U.S., where we looked at not only test scores, but also grades, and we looked at extracurricular activities. So I'd be really curious to hear all of your opinions on that issue. Thanks.
I can jump in. You heard other excuses too. Say China is not fit for democracy because our economy is so bad, and they said China cannot do education because they have so many people. That's all what I call. I think they put the horse and wagon the other way, and they didn't realize we are in this situation because we didn't change our education. So that's what I always tell people. I said, you got it the wrong way, and I said we can change. We're here because we did this. So you cannot use this as an excuse for not moving forward. So that's how I base it. I think it's no excuse. Japan did it, and Korea did it, and actually China now is doing that. China is forcing primary schools to forget about testing and doing multiple sources of evaluation, which is actually very kind of nerve-wracking for many parents. They just say, how is my kid doing compared to others? By the way, another thing about authoritarian systems, it's seldom it's very seldom criterion reference. It's all norm referenced in testing. That means it's not about what you know or how well you are, it's how much better you are than other people. So in China, we always say that there's 没有最好，只有更好. You are only good when you are better than others. So you got to beat somebody else. So it really doesn't matter how much you know. You just need to be test slightly better than the next guy. You're good. You know.
But Professor Zhao, just to play a little bit of devil's advocate and to speak for some of my Chinese friends in education, they're also worried, and it seems to me genuinely worried, that if they admit multiple criteria, that opens up channels for corruption. That's one of the claims that they make, and is there nothing to that?
Oh, there's a lot. I wrote in the book about the corruption case. China, once it's opening up, it begins to have more corruption. It's because more subjective judgment. But I think that's the process you have to go through. You know, remember in the beginning, China opened up economically when government was not controlling the making of shoes. We bought a lot of really cardboard shoes. You know, it's out of Windsor. People made a lot of fake products. Then gradually through, I think, the market selection, eventually it's there. I think I would rather go that route to have schools more select. Another reason for corruption is, I think I call this in the tragedy of the common good, tragedy of the common. Because right now, university admissions is government resources. You admit one bad student, it's not going to affect you, as individually. So there's no pride in that sense. And what if universities truly become more autonomous? They have a much care about their own reputation. It's much more likely that they would commit those fraud. So I think that's we need to go a different route. It's inevitable. It will happen. And even in American campuses, University of Illinois, my alma mater, had happened. Remember that 2 years ago? Big scandal of those people, and so it always happens. But I think we have to experiment to move to a better situation, because if you don't give this up, you will never be able to move forward.
There was go back to the back corner, and we're got a little time cushion, but we come to the end of the formal program, but there's so many questions. I definitely want to give people a chance to ask them. We will not be offended if you have to move out, but let's go for very short questions and very short answers. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jordan Davis. I'm a student I'm an MPP student at American University. My question is, I saw the hearing on the subcommittee hearing on the Confucius Institutes, and my question is, they did make a few policy recommendations about what they think Congress or just universities could do in order to alleviate some of the issues with self-censorship. But my question is, do you think there's any policies that could be put into place that could negatively impact the cultural exchange of these international exchanges, I guess, between China and the U.S.?
I actually founded the Michigan State University Confucius Institute. I operated for a few years, and so I know about I dealt with Hanban very extensively. But one of the things I did, I did not accept a co-director from China. I run the whole thing. And I did not accept any teachers from China. I run the whole thing. And I designed the whole thing. And also, particularly, my program was focused on improving Mandarin language teaching. So we built the first online high school teach Mandarin. I designed the game to do that. But my experience was that I was very steadfast. This belongs to college education. When we need anybody from yours, I will ask you. But we trained our own teachers. So I basically bypassed the system. What we meant, we were the best Confucius Institute. We won awards. I think it's a matter of negotiation. And by the way, I mean, we're going to talk a lot more. I don't think Confucius Institute itself is evil. We really should interact with some of those. But the way it's arranged sometimes can appear to be really strange.
I mean, I would say very quickly that I think the concern that you raise is a valid one. I think one challenge that universities have had is that they're sometimes not taking into account the expertise of people who really know China when they are negotiating, or whatever country they're working in, when they're negotiating arrangements, whether they're Confucius Institutes or partnerships, university campuses, et cetera, overseas. And they're maybe not being there hasn't maybe been a history. I mean, this is all a little murky because all these memoranda of understanding that universities sign are by and large not public. But I think there's some legitimate questions about how much are we talking up front about academic freedom and free expression and safeguarding of those things. Does that necessarily mean that American universities and Chinese universities have to agree about it? I don't think so. But they at least need to know where each other stands. And I think that's a valuable thing that's come out of some of this contentiousness, such as the stuff that led to the hearing.
Yes. 1, 2, 3. Let's take all 3 short questions together, and then final answers, and we'll conclude.
Donald Barnes. I teach at South China University of Technology in Guangzhou. We've taught in China for 10 years at tertiary schools, secondary, and at Beida for 2 years. Our experience has been similar to what you said. I've received an email this morning from a friend of mine who is working on a book for parents to buy who want their Chinese students to take the TOEFL exam and so they can come to the U.S. for primary school.
I want to cut straight to questions because we've overtime.
The question is, you've talked about what the situation is. I'd like to hear your predictions of where we will be in 15 years from now.
Okay, second question, sir.
Mark Lenhart from CET Academic Programs. I'm curious if any of you could talk about what seems to be a decline in the number of American students going to China. IIE's Open Doors has come out and suggested that there is a decrease, and we're also hearing that Chinese language enrollment at freshman year across the country is actually going down. I'm wondering how you explain this phenomenon.
Last question, sir.
Tom, I'm with the Congressional Research Service. My question is, how are Chinese students evaluated, Chinese applicants for U.S. universities? Because it seems like the criteria are so much geared towards U.S. High school students with extracurricular activities, sports, leadership, recommendations, and that I don't see how that translates how Chinese high school students would have those opportunities. Are the standards lowered at all, or are they just changed somewhat for Chinese applicants? Thanks.
Well, to answer the last question first, sometimes schools are really just looking at single things like SATs, but actually the holistic admissions process has actually been a problematic thing, in part because American colleges aren't explaining fully why they're asking for those things. But I mean, take this as an easy example. I mean, you mentioned extracurriculars, but recommendations from your guidance counselor. Now, there is a small and growing industry of for-profit guidance counselors in China, but by and large, there are no guidance counselors in China. And so to demand that a Chinese student submit a recommendation from a guidance counselor, it's an impossible task to fill. And unfortunately, what we had seen happen was that, well, you hire somebody, your family hires somebody, and voila, you have a recommendation from a guidance counselor. And so I think a lot of the very real problems with admissions and application fraud, not just in China but elsewhere, stem from a lot of these problems where the educational system and the admission system of the United States just doesn't conform in the least bit to what's happening in China.
Well, I think a couple of things. I think in 15 years, what's going to happen, it really depends on what we do during the 15 years. That thing will happen, it just depends on if we take proactive action to really get a better understanding of each other. I'm surprised in the age of Google and the internet is that we actually still know each other very little because we have a preset mindset to read other people. So that's why I write the book to get a better understanding. You have the experience there that's different. So I think we need to do much more proactive, and I'm glad Bloomington is doing this. And the other thing, I really think the decline of enrollment is actually very natural. You remember 1957, 58, where the Russians, 1980s, the Japanese. So the China fatigue, I think is very natural. Actually, it's returned to normal. I really think it's kind of return to the mean, to the regression back to the mean. This might be more normal. So because China has been on the radar screen for how long? For about 5-10 years now. I actually wish China is not such hot top politicized, because every time you go to Fox News, and they really politicize a lot of things, that's treated as a neighbor, as a spouse, as someone we just interact with. Let's get more facts there than opinion about a lot of those things. And I think the final thing, you're right, Karin is absolutely about that. A lot of Chinese schools now, they are trying to quantify American schools' admissions. So they say, so how many community services are you looking for? 14. Okay, I'm going to do 14. I know a school fly their students to Tibet. And so those children can give gifts to blind children in a Tibet monastery, and then shoot a photo, send to Colombia, they get admitted. See, I'm doing charitable work. There are even wealthy parents send their children to Africa to give school bags to Botswana kids. And so that's community. So they try to quantify every one of them. Wherever they cannot quantify, they have templates. So it's just fascinating to look at how the view of one type of education can drive your behavior. They treat SAT as called Chinese Gaokao, American Gaokao. So they prepare the same way. By the way, from College Board, and Peggy, you may know this, the best AP scores coming from China. Chinese, they don't even know what's going on, but even their teachers may not even speak English, but they get best AP scores because they're trained to take the AP. And they're very well done in a lot of international schools. Not international school, most public schools, international divisions.
Yeah. Let me just say one thing quickly about the 15 years. I think we will probably have a good sense about 15 years and about 5 years, because I do think that this is a very, very critical time on both sides, actually, because we will start seeing a lot of this sort of massive cohort coming back to China, and what is their experience when they return, I think will dictate a lot about what both American universities want and Chinese families want to.
Also, Mark Leonard's very important question, I think, and we can talk about this a little bit more. So some people will be dining with us in just a few minutes. I think there are several reasons. One is that public schools do not value foreign language teaching. In fact, they're cutting back on those programs. Those tend to be some of the first programs that go when budgets have to be cut, with the result that when I was coming up, we started foreign language studies in middle school. It's now off in high school. Optional even then. We really need to get foreign language studies as a core of curriculum beginning in elementary school. At the other side, there's a problem with the universities, which is that area studies have long been out of vogue now in the academy. It's not seen as a serious academic discipline, nor are foreign language studies seen as a serious academic discipline. It's seen as a craft skill to be acquired, sort of, on the side. So our universities are also very much to blame. And lastly, I would say we've had a failure of leadership on this very important issue. We had an impulse, which I supported, which we saw in the 100,000 Strong organization, which I also support. But the downside of that has been people ask these questions, say, well, this is why we have 100,000 strong. And so everything sort of gets dumped over there, and you say, but what has 100,000 strong actually done in terms of getting more people to speak Chinese better? And we're not sure about that. So I would say there are problems at the primary, secondary, tertiary level, and at the leadership level. Thank you very much. The Kissinger Institute looks forward to working with all of you to try to address these problems. Thank you, Professor Zhao and Karin. 谢谢. Yes, we go to the bathroom, we go to 6th floor. Yeah.